Well, thank you all so much for being here, and thank you, Teresa, for that warm introduction and for the work that the folks at KBOO do. It's so important to defend independent media and to keep community media outlets alive, and I'm honored always to be on the airwaves of KBOO, and I'm truly honored to be here at Powell's because we desperately need a response to these behemoth corporations and an independent way to distribute books so that it's not also going for nefarious activities of mega corporations. So thank you to the folks here at Powell's for everything that you do. I want to begin at the outset here by just embarrassing someone who I've actually never met, but my good friend Sophie Ragsdale, who's a colleague of mine at The Nation. I understand her dad is here, and I just wanted to wish him a happy Father's Day from his daughter in person. So happy Father's Day, Mr. Ragsdale. Wherever you are. I want to begin just by apologizing if some of the things that I talk about tonight are already known to you. I'm sure that there are many of you in this room that follow these events and incidents very closely, and some of the territory that I'm going to cover tonight you may already be aware of, so sorry in advance if some of what I tell you already knew. In the updated version of my book, I have about 130, 140 pages of completely new material, and then I went through the book and I updated some of the key facts surrounding the congressional investigation into Blackwater, as well as some of the lawsuits that have been filed against the company, but also looking at the lethal, deadly events of the past year, as well as ending the book with a new chapter called Blackwater Beyond Bush that looks at the future of these companies and what's at stake in the 2008 presidential election. But I want to begin by telling a story that I'm sure all of you heard about and followed, and it happened last year on the afternoon of September 16th, 2007, in Baghdad, in an area called the Mansour district. And it was an area that I knew well. I've been there many times in my travels to Iraq, and it used to be a real upscale part of the Iraqi capital, and now it's a sort of a hollow shell of its former self. But on this particular day, a 20-year-old Iraqi medical student named Ahmed Haytham al-Rubai was driving in a car with his mother, Mahasin, the family's white Opel sedan. His mother also was a doctor, and they had just dropped off his father, Dr. Jawad. He also was a doctor. Medicine was very much in this family's DNA, and in fact, they had made a conscious decision to remain in Iraq. Like some fortunate Iraqis, they had the opportunity to leave their country when the U.S. invaded, and they decided not to do that because as a family they believed that their services as medical professionals would be needed more than ever in their country as it was preparing to absorb a barrage of violence and chaos. And so this family stayed, and on this particular day when Ahmed was driving his mother Mahasin, they were running errands. Among the errands they were running was dropping off college applications for Ahmed's younger sister, and they pulled into the Mansour neighborhood, and at the time they were approaching a major intersection. A convoy of armored vehicles was careening down the wrong side of a one-way road, and Iraqi police officers in the square that day, which was Nisr Square, scrambled to cut off traffic. This is common in Iraq. When the most important people in Iraq come careening down the road, the Iraqi police have to stop traffic. And of course, the most important people in Iraq are not Iraqis, they are U.S. VIPs. And so on this day, when these armored vehicles were coming into the square and Ahmed and his mother were pulling into the square, the men inside of the armored vehicles decided that they viewed Ahmed Haytham al-Rubai and his mother Mahasin as potential terrorists or car bombers, and they decided to shoot Ahmed Haytham al-Rubai in his head. And after they shot him, his mother began shrieking. And we know this from the testimony, and I write about this in the book of eyewitnesses that day. She started shrieking and grabbing onto her son and hollering, help me, my son. And two Iraqi police officers responded, and they describe how they tried to pull her out of the vehicle, and that her grip was so tight on her son's body that they couldn't get her out. And they saw that the men in the armored vehicles were once again training their weapons on the car, and they were concerned that more shots were going to come, and the Iraqi police officers held up their hands to show that they themselves were not armed, but also to try to make clear that what they were doing was trying to get this woman out of the car. And then it became apparent to the Iraqi police officers that more shots were going to be coming, and they ran away from the car, and indeed a barrage of gunfire rained down on that vehicle, and witnesses say that the car exploded and burst into flames. burning Mahassan and her son Ahmed inside of the vehicle. That kicked off 15 minutes of very heavy gunfire at Nicer Square that day, and it lasted about, as I say, a quarter of an hour. At the end of it, 17 Iraqi civilians were dead. Among the other victims was a 9-year-old boy named Ali who was shot in his head, and his father described having his hand over his son's heart and still feeling it beating and running to a hospital trying to save his son's life, and then arriving there and the doctors telling him that there was nothing that they could do, that his son was dead. And this man's name was Mohammed. He returned the next day to gather pieces of his son's skull that he could find in the square, because he wanted to try to bury as much of the body as he could find in the Iraqi holy city of Najaf. Children were killed that day, women were killed that day. In fact, several people who survived, and also some who were killed, were shot in the back as they tried to flee the scene. And the individuals who did the shooting that day from those armored vehicles were not members of the United States military on active duty. They weren't members of Muqtada al-Sadr's Mahdi army or al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. They were private forces working for Blackwater. And what happened after this played out in the international media. The Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki was under the mistaken impression that he actually was in charge of the country, and the Iraqi government ordered Blackwater as a company to leave Iraq. And the Iraqi judicial system indicated that it intended to prosecute the shooters as they would any criminal who had committed this kind of an act in the country. Of course, things are not so simple. Nouri al-Maliki is not the Prime Minister of Iraq. Condoleezza Rice apparently is. And Jalal Talabani is not the president. George Bush apparently is. And so the Bush administration got on the phone, ostensibly to offer an apology, but more importantly to read the riot act to its puppet regime in Baghdad. And for 3 days, Blackwater's work was in fact shut down while this crisis played out, this what was described as a diplomatic crisis between Baghdad and Washington. And on the 4th day, Blackwater's operatives were armed and back on the streets of Iraq again, and it became perhaps the most potent symbol of the utter lack of sovereignty in Iraq that Blackwater's men were back on the streets. In fact, we learned just how deeply embedded and how central to the U.S. occupation Blackwater is when those 3 days went down that Blackwater wasn't working. No U.S. officials could go anywhere. No non-military officials could go anywhere. An Iraqi friend of mine said they turned the green zone into the green zoo because they were all essentially trapped in there with the Cinnabons and the espressos and Burger King. But what's important to understand here is how the White House responded to this. Now, Blackwater works on a U.S. State Department contract. A lot of people believe that Blackwater works for the military. Blackwater does not work for the military. Blackwater works directly for the White House. Which means that it's outside of the military command structure, and it also means that, in the words of Congressman Dennis Kucinich, it is effectively an armed wing of the administration operating in Iraq. And so Blackwater guards the State Department in Iraq, and the individuals tasked with investigating, quote-unquote, Blackwater right away after this were in fact State Department personnel who depended on Blackwater to keep them alive while they were investigating Blackwater. Now, if you or I were accused of killing anyone or crimes of a much less serious nature, if we're lucky in this country, we would be read something called the Miranda rights. We'd be told we had the right to remain silent, that anything we say can and will be used against us in a court of law. When State Department investigators interviewed the individuals at the center of this shooting, they gave them something called limited use immunity.